Welcome to Narrative Responsibility, a podcast about examining the meta-story of your life, how well it is serving you, and how to change it for the better. I'm Elena Wolf, relationship coach and life alignment mentor, and this is this week's New Perspective. Hi there! I'm so glad you're here today. This is episode 39, Subjugating the Body. Before we get into the topic, just a bit of housekeeping. I want to acknowledge that I have fallen off of being consistently a once-a-week podcast and explain why. I am going back to graduate school, and I honestly have no idea how well I will be able to maintain a weekly production schedule, or if I can get back into one, maybe with that external structure forcing me to be more mindful. I have realized just in a content production sense that the scripts I'm writing have gotten longer. My episodes are now consistently, 30 to 40 minutes, not the 20 to 30 I was initially expecting. And that means that my scripts are like basically chapters in books. So while it's kind of cool that I'm just out here writing, 2 personal development books a year for you guys, it's also a lot. So I love doing it. I don't say this because I have any intention to stop doing it. It's more just like, I don't simply get on here and ramble. I really take time to think through what I'm going to say and organize my thoughts. Sometimes I'm writing scripts multiple times, and there have been times when I have recorded a script that I thought was good on paper and then didn't work, performed, and so I had to go back and redo it again. That actually happened recently with what was supposed to be this episode, in fact. Instead, I think that's going to be next week because I think I figured out what the problem is. We'll see. That one's on the female body specifically. But anyway, I do appreciate the time that you spend with me whenever you do it, however you do it, whether it's as soon as an episode comes out or if you wait till there's a cluster of them and, binge them or whatever. And I just want to thank you again for being here and enjoying this creative ride with me. So, all of that housekeeping out of the way, let's talk about today's episode. This is another in our series of deep dives into the reasons that we get cut off from our body, our self that is. And what I intend to discuss today is some of the ways that our culture in the West, so specifically in America, although I think this is probably fairly true for the West in general, but the ways that our culture of hierarchy and power over kind of reinforce or maybe even create that division between mind and body, self that acts and self that is. This topic is actually an offshoot of my last episode about why I hate exercise. To recap, or in case you haven't listened to that episode yet, to sum up, the reason that I hate the concept of exercise has to do with the philosophy that underpins it. Basically, I was taught exercise as this top-down obedience either to an external authority like a coach or to an external goal like running a certain distance or maintaining a certain heart rate for a predetermined length of time. These external authorities are to be followed or obeyed over the comfort and needs of the body itself. On a practical level, this comes from the school system's lockstep physical education classes that condition us early on to obey the authority or receive a punishment. It is reinforced if you play sports because players are taught to heed the coach, not themselves. And it's also reinforced in the fitness industry, which tells us to trust the trainer, instructor, fitness guru to lead us to the results that we want. So one of the things that I realized as I was scripting that episode is that I had two competing ideas. One was simply, I hate exercise. And the other was where this adherence to obedience comes from. So that's what I want to talk about today, the sort of social philosophy underneath the reasons for our various cultural, social structures and institutions that give us the mindset of listening to external authorities rather than our own bodies. So where did this idea come from? Where did we get the notion that we needed to listen to some external authority about what to do with our own bodies and how to manage them? Well, it's linked to our general cultural indoctrination into hierarchical control and fear-based reinforcement systems. It might be 2024 as I'm recording this, but most of the cultural institutions we live with today were architected in the late 1800s. These are things like our police state and our schools. Thus, the underlying perspective they reflect comes from that time. The time before women could vote. The time before civil rights and voting rights for non-white people were respected. The time when you could be put in jail for being gay. The time before psychology was a field of study. The time when people were still alive who had been enslaved or doing the enslaving of other human beings on American soil. The time when Darwin's theory of evolution was still controversial. The time when people thought it was fine to kidnap indigenous children and place them in abusive schools, literally designed to strip them of their language and customs, and sometimes lives, in the name of saving their souls. The time when factory workers were considered as interchangeable as machined parts. You know, that time. Western society has a deep-rooted pathology of coercion of the less powerful by the more powerful. And it is a relative, not absolute, degree of power and position in the hierarchy. So you can be simultaneously coerced from above and coercing whoever is below you. Now, the roots of these philosophies of power can be traced backwards through history to a point before written records, but even just looking at what the current American systems are rooted in, again, that sort of cultural period from the late 1800s, the post-Civil War period, you can see how this power differential is built in. We have a primarily fee-based legal system that makes laws optional for those with money. Pay a fine or go to jail. Pay a good enough attorney to be acquitted by a confused jury, or make a plea bargain even if you're innocent to pick a lesser of two evil outcomes. The state has the authority to detain a person and to inflict violence upon their person, including the ultimate violence of death. We have Calvinistic strains of the Christian church that reject the physical body as dirty, weak, sinful, and only fit to be governed harshly by a mind that is focused on the godly. And even as our culture has in many ways loosened and changed, there's also still parts of it that believe deeply in these notions. And anyone who grew up in that sort of cult, and I do believe it's a cult, were explicitly taught that they were wrong and flawed simply for existing and having a body, and that the body itself was wrong and flawed and the seat of all their sin and suffering. The only goals, really, were to have power over the body via the mind, and then to give the mind's power over to God via the church. In other words, to subsume one's own sovereignty, not just to a higher authority on a spiritual level, like your mind goes to God, but also on a physical level, the body goes to the church. This separation of mind and body, and mind over body, and authority over mind and body was carried into a lot of the social behaviors, morals, manners, and even laws, because yes, these people lobbied and or got elected into positions of power where they could make laws, interpret laws, enforce laws. This is literally still happening, where there are laws being interpreted or enacted that many people disagree with, but those with this particularly cultish moral authority from a specific type of Christianity are in positions of authority, getting to decide for all of us. And it's a problem. So yeah, part of the social, cultural, moral philosophy built in this mind over body, and this body as something to be controlled and punished simply for existing. And then the structure of the public schools were based originally on treating all children the same and expecting them to conform to the standards that were set by the teachers. Initially, those were even enforced with physical retribution, again, because of that churchy, moralistic, supposedly moralistic kind of thinking, spare the rod, spoil the child. That is not how it works. We know this now, but they didn't then. But they built our institutions. And I'm pretty sure that there was an awareness implicit in this kind of philosophy that the behaviors being sought were not natural or normal. But because there was this underlying belief that human nature itself was innately flawed and savage and in need of being controlled by violence, then this cognitive dissonance didn't really register. They were like, yeah, of course we're trying to behave in this unnatural, quote unquote, civilized way because uncivilized behavior is awful. So there was this assumption that people were basically caged animals, and the only way to civilize them was to terrorize them into obedience. And if the terror of eternal damnation was not enough, then the violence of the school or the state would have to do. And that's where a lot of our cultural institutions were built, with that kind of underlying belief structure about what it means to be human, what it means to be civilized, and what is necessary to get someone to behave in this civilized, supposedly moral and virtuous way. Now, I am very blessed to live in an era where we are crawling out from under this dark legacy. There's a lot of awareness, I think, on the part of people working inside the school system, for example, that we need to be able to accommodate different types of learning, different types of personalities, different types of needs, and that punishment is not the answer, that empathy actually gets you much further. We've had more or less a century of sort of thinkers and thought leaders in fields like psychology and psychotherapy and counseling, and also teaching. I'm thinking here of people like Anna Freud and Magdalena Gerber, who have really helped us to recognize that children are unique individuals and they have specific needs. They're not just miniature adults that have the same, mental and emotional capacities and resilience that a fully grown adult ought to have. That in fact they need to be treated differently, and that they can be damaged very deeply by harsh treatment. So we're sort of culturally deconstructing a lot of that underlying awfulness, that underlying belief that humans are essentially evil. So we're in this phase of sort of deconstructing that underlying belief structure about the innate, flawed, and morally reprehensible nature of the human animal, but it's slow going, and difficult to transform institutions that were built on that belief structure to begin with. So it is a long and slow and imperfect process to change those institutions and to change the culture where so many traditions were basically built to reinforce that philosophy because they were built on that philosophy to begin with. So you might change one thing and then there's still 50 more and you have to change each one of them individually. And that takes time. And while we're trying to do this, while we're trying to make these changes at the macro level, there's still pushback from people who are bought into the old system and belief structure for one reason or another, whether it's sort of bad faith, they know that that old structure maintains their power and they don't want to give it up, or good faith, they genuinely believe that that structure and that belief, that set of beliefs describes the best way to exist in the world. So as a maybe specific example of the ways that the old system still inhibits our relationship to our bodies, just look at stimming. It is something that is commonly associated with neurodivergent people, whether we're talking the autism spectrum or ADHD. And it's something that I think there's now an awareness that certain people have neurological wiring that makes it difficult or impossible for them to control those behaviors or not engage in them. But how often are those behaviors considered signs of disrespect or a disruptive action if you are someone who is supposedly neurotypical, like whatever that means. If you're a neurotypical engaging in those behaviors, if you're fidgeting, if you're moving yourself in a certain way to regulate your energy or to help you focus or to help your sensory overload to calm down. Like if you're not identified as neurodivergent, then you're a problem for engaging in any of those very normal human behaviors. It's an old school expectation that children and adults should be able to sit still and not move their bodies for extended periods of time. That somehow personal stillness is a mark of maturity and responsibility. And I mean, how many people are commonly suppressing movements that they would otherwise make? How many people are suppressing their relationship to their body itself because they have this pressure from our culture, from these beliefs that they need to not be fidgety, that they need to not be restless, that they need to be like still and grave and, mature. Like seriously, what does one have to do with the other? How does the ability to force your body to conform to a certain rigid set of expectations and cut off from the input in your body, how does that have anything to do with your ability to make a good decision or to be responsible or to be a good employee or good at your job? It doesn't. It doesn't. Like, it just doesn't. And and yet we still live under this kind of oppressive expectation that when we grow up, by the time we're adult, we don't need to move anymore unless it's necessary movement. There's no joyful movement. There is no moving just to express things or anything like that. If you've never thought about how still we are expected to be as adults, take notice of body language as you go about your week. Children, especially young children, move joyfully in their bodies. They dance and spin and jump and wiggle. They allow energy to run through their physical bodies. Adults rarely do and are often looked at curiously or even mockingly if they do. Children have not yet taken on this cultural restriction against expressing anything via their bodies. Adults don't want to draw attention to themselves by moving too much or in the wrong ways. Okay, so pulling this back to last week's episode about exercise. Again, as I was writing that script and found those two competing ideas, I realized that they needed to be separate topics and addressed separately. So this second idea, that our culture and even language represent and reinforce a relationship of power over between our body and our mind. Basically, the belief structure of our culture puts our mind, our self that acts, in a position of coercive, punitive authority over our self that is. This belief structure celebrates the internalization of those coercive impulses, that authoritarianism. And that internalized belief system might not be the reason that we act abusively toward our body in and of itself, but it is the reason that we don't automatically perceive self-directed abuse as a bad thing. So that is the culture and the belief aspect. That basically, we have these cultural and institutional structures that normalize external authority having power over us and the right to inflict violence upon us, and we internalize that. We might not inflict violence on ourselves just because we have that belief that it's possible or that something or someone has the right to. But if we are then put into a circumstance where we're triggered toward that behavior or pushed toward that behavior for any reason, then we have a belief structure that makes us think, oh, yes, that is the natural consequence of whatever it is that I did wrong, or the natural consequence of how I simply exist in the world, because my body's innately flawed. My body is innately sinful. My body is innately deserving of punishment and harshness and being controlled by an external authority. Even if the authority controlling the body is your egoic mind, it is still an external authority to the body itself, to that self that is. So this is going to be one of those podcasts where I have a whole lot of rambling to get us set up and then not actually a whole lot more. But I do from here want to focus on the language that is used, because this was actually what got me thinking about whether I had two different ideas that were competing. Because I found when I was talking about the relationship that I wanted with my body, that I kept using language that had a secondary meaning of power and control. And I was fascinated by that. I was racking my brain looking at a thesaurus trying to figure out, are there other ways to say this that don't embed the notion of authority over, power over, violence against, or potential violence against into this relationship just with the language, and I couldn't find them. So I don't even know if the description of how I want to relate to my body even ended up in the final cut. But so you don't have to go back and listen. What I dream of is having control of my body in the sense of being graceful, coordinated, flexible, and strong enough in all of my muscle groups to be able to do things like pistol squats, like that one where you stick one leg straight out and you go down. Those are very hard. They take a lot of strength and a lot of control and a lot of coordination to be able to do that. And I want to be able to dance smoothly. I want to be able to move in a way that is fluid and deliberate, not jerky or sort of flailing where my body's just kind of like moving with the forces of gravity or inertia as opposed to moving with the force of my muscles. So that's what I mean when I say that I want to be in control of my body. And that's what I want. That is a relationship to my body that would be enhanced by, quote, exercise, and a reason for me to exercise, to try and grow that type of relationship. And to get that kind of relationship with your body, to have a body that is strong enough and trained enough, takes a lot of discipline. Discipline in the sense of adherence to a training regimen and to making a regular practice of movement and exertion and strength building. But I noticed a theme to these words that I was using: control, discipline, train. All of them have at least two meanings, one of which is a value-neutral description of a process, and the other of which is steeped in violent coercion. For example, when you hear discipline, do you think of having a regular practice of a skill or a process, which perhaps you even prioritize over other things? Or do you hear discipline and think punishment for breaking rules? Perhaps you're even picturing a corporal punishment, a violent physical punishment. Or when you hear control, do you picture deliberateness, focus, and gentle direction? Or do you picture something like piloting a machine, or the subjugation of one person's will to another via, yet again, violence or the threat of violence? When you hear training or well-trained, do you think of someone who put in a lot of time and energy and reps to gain skill mastery? Or do you think of Pavlovian conditioning and animals whose natural instincts and normal ways of being have been overridden by reward punishment circuits? Okay, so all that said, I do give us as human beings credit for being able to understand context and nuance. We can most of the time pick up on the intended meaning. So I'm not going to pretend like I misunderstood the words I was choosing. And I found it fascinating that I couldn't find words to describe the ways I want my body to move or the relationship that I want with my body that could not be interpreted as authoritarianism. In other words, that did not have an interpretation for that language that was coercion of my body, myself that is, by myself that acts. Whether that coercion is direct, as in my mind is directly telling my body what it is to do, or indirect, as in my mind has decided I'm going to give authority to this person and let them tell me what I am to do with my body. Either way, it is forcing the self that is to perform whatever tasks are being demanded, regardless of how the self that is feels about those tasks or feels doing those tasks. And it did make me wonder, how many times did my own emotional wires get crossed over the years hearing language like this when I was thinking of adhering to a training regimen as discipline, but, also maybe hearing that regimen as a punishment for my personal failures or for my body's inadequacies. How many times did I force my body to do something it didn't want to do, or maybe to stop doing something it wanted to continue, and then congratulate myself on having good self-control. How many times did you? How much of this violent coercion did you internalize against your own body? Whether that's denying it food or rest or gentleness in the name of achievement or discipline or progress. Or even something worse, whether it was directly trying to punish and harm your body because it was flawed, inadequate, not enough. Interesting questions, right? Hard questions, I think, if you've never asked them before. So I'll leave you here and let you think about them. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. And if you want to know more about my work, you can check out thepatternbreaker.com or my abandoned Instagram at thepatternbreaker. You can look at my Patreon, patreon.com/narrative responsibility for some cool perks and just, a chance to encourage me to keep going. And until next time, what part of your story are you going to take responsibility for this week?